Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into the strange, dark, and mysterious corners of today's story, I want to take a quick moment to say a massive thank you to all of you. It's honestly your incredible support and enthusiasm that have allowed these stories to reach more people than I ever imagined. Thank you for choosing to join me on this journey as we try to make sense of the unexplainable. Now, buckle up because today's story is a wild one. Story 1, The Factory of Horrors, Unit 731. In the spring of 1936, a brilliant doctor named Shiro Ishii was given a massive budget and a top-secret facility in the Pingfang district of Harbin, China. He was a man of science, a dedicated family man, and a patriot who claimed his only goal was to protect his country from disease. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what any elite medical researcher would do for their nation. But instead of saving lives, Shiro Ishii would transform a state-of-the-art medical laboratory into a literal slaughterhouse where patients were referred to as logs of wood, and the most advanced medical tools were used to see just how much pain a human could endure before they simply gave up. The mystery is not just the cruelty that happened there, but why a man dedicated to healing would systematically erase his own humanity. Tonight, I am going to tell you 12 stories about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. But before we get into our first case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please offer to buy the like button a fresh medical-grade face mask to keep it safe, but then the second it tries to put it on, I want you to snap the elastic bands and run away. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing Lamte Now these stories travel across the globe. Now, let us get into our first story. The air in the Pingfang district didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy with a thick chemical stench of formalin that clung to the back of your throat. It was a sharp, biting smell that mixed with the faint, persistent odor of something burning in the massive chimneys nearby. The wind would whistle through the gaps in the heavy iron gates, carrying with it a metallic tang that tasted like copper on your tongue. In the silence of the night, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the industrial furnaces that never seemed to stop. Shiro Ishii was 44 years old and was the kind of man people instinctively respected. He had a sharp military bearing and wore glasses that made him look more like a quiet university professor than a lieutenant general. He was a father who loved his children and a husband who enjoyed quiet evenings at home. He was the kind of person who would spend hours meticulously organizing his library. Ishii was obsessed with order and precision. He believed that the world could be perfected through the lens of a microscope. To his colleagues, he was a visionary, a man who was willing to push the boundaries of science for the greater good of the empire. He walked with a slight click of his polished boots, a sound that became synonymous with progress in the halls of the secret laboratory. Every morning, Shiro Ishii followed the exact same routine, with a level of discipline that was almost frightening. He would wake up at precisely 5:30, wash his face with cold water, and dress in his perfectly pressed uniform. He would spend exactly 10 minutes polishing his glasses until there wasn't a single smudge on the lenses. He enjoyed the quiet ritual of preparing for a long day. He would walk through the main corridor of the facility, nodding to the guards who stood at attention. He'd enter his office, sit at his mahogany desk, and begin sorting through the daily reports. He would use a fountain pen to make tiny, precise notes in the margins. He would check the inventory of chemicals, the temperature of the refrigeration units, and the status of the new arrivals. He would then take a slow walk through the laboratory wings. He would stop at each station, watching the technicians work. He would observe the way they handled the glass slides, the way they calibrated the scales, and the way they recorded their findings. He wouldn't speak much, but his presence was felt in every corner of the room. Everything had to be done in a specific, repeatable way. He would spend hours just watching the steam rise from the sterilization vats. He liked the way the heat felt on his skin, a sharp contrast to the biting cold outside. He would count the number of footsteps it took to get from the main lab to the holding cells. It was always 342. He found comfort in that number. It meant that nothing had changed. Nothing was out of place. He would then eat a simple lunch of rice and fish, sitting alone in the mess hall. He would chew his food slowly, precisely 20 times for every bite, while staring at the wall. He wasn't thinking about the people in the cells. He was thinking about data. He was thinking about the way bacteria grew in a petri dish. To him, there was no difference between a cell of skin and a human being. The shift happened on a Tuesday morning during the third week of October. Ishii was doing his usual rounds, his boots clicking rhythmically on the concrete floor when he stopped in front of cell number 12. Usually, the people inside were silent or pleading, but this time, it was different. A man was sitting in the corner, staring at the door. He wasn't crying. He was just watching. As Ishii adjusted his glasses, the man in the cell spoke. He didn't ask for water or mercy. He simply said Ishii's full name and his birth date. He said it with a calm, flat tone that shouldn't have been possible for someone in his position. Ishii froze. He had never met this man before. This person was supposed to be just a number, a log of wood to be used for an experiment. The man then mentioned a small private detail about Ishii's daughter, something that only a close family member would know. Ishii felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He looked down at his clipboard, but the ink seemed to blur. He looked back at the man, but the prisoner had already turned his back, returning to his silent vigil. You are standing in that dimly lit hallway. You are holding a clipboard that contains the names of people who are no longer considered human. You hear the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant, muffled sound of a struggle. Do you stop and ask how this stranger knows your deepest secrets? Or do you keep walking, pretending that the logic of your world is still intact? Because here is the thing. Ishii didn't have time to process the fear. He had a schedule to keep. He had a country to save. But for the first time in his career, the clicking of his boots felt hollow. He realized that the walls he had built between science and morality were starting to crumble. The prisoner wasn't just a log of wood anymore. He was a mirror reflecting something dark. The bizarre reveal came weeks later when Ishii ordered the man from cell 12 to be moved to the main lab for a special procedure. As they strapped the man to the table, Ishii realized why the man knew so much. Tucked under the man's fingernail was a tiny, rolled-up piece of rice paper. It wasn't a message from a spy. It was a list of names and dates written in Ishii's own handwriting. It was a page from Ishii's own private diary that had been missing for months. The man wasn't a psychic or a ghost. He was a former janitor who had worked in Ishii's own home back in Japan before being caught up in a sweep of political prisoners. He had recognized Ishii the moment he saw him, but Ishii had become so blinded by his own science that he hadn't even recognized his own employee. The man had been using the information to keep himself sane, to remind himself that he was a human being who knew things, while Ishii had become the true monster who saw nothing but numbers. Shiro Ishii survived the war. He was never charged with war crimes because he made a deal with the United States to turn over all of his research in exchange for total immunity from prosecution. He lived out the rest of his life in quiet retirement, but those who knew him said he never looked at a mirror again. He died of throat cancer in 1959. But while Ishii was hiding his secrets in Japan, thousands of miles away in a basement at Harvard University, a young physics student was about to find out that some secrets refused to stay buried in the past. Story 2. The Quantum Observer, Lyman Lab, Harvard. In the late 20th century, a dedicated physics graduate student named Sam was working late nights at the Lyman Laboratory at Harvard University. He was a skeptic by nature, a man who believed only in what could be measured, calculated, and proven. He had a brilliant future in academia and a deep respect for the cold, hard logic of the universe. He was exactly where he needed to be, pursuing a career that defined his entire identity. But instead of finishing his groundbreaking thesis, Sam would find himself paralyzed by something that defied every law of physics he had ever studied. He would encounter a figure that did not just walk through walls, but seemed to exist in a physical space that his instruments simply could not see. The mystery is why a man of pure science would eventually abandon his research entirely because of a shadow that should not have been there. Before we go any further, if you are a fan of things that should not exist, please invite the like button to look through a high-powered electron microscope. Tell it that it is about to see the building blocks of reality, but the second it leans in and closes one eye, I want you to flip the light switch, grab it by the shoulders, and whisper that there is someone standing right behind it. Now, let us get into our second story. The air inside the Lyman laboratory at 3 o'clock in the morning had a very specific quality to it. It was thick with the low, constant hum of the massive electrical generators that lived in the basement. It was a sound you didn't just hear with your ears, but felt in the soles of your feet. The floor was made of reinforced concrete, and it radiated a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep through the thickest rubber boots. Everything in that room felt heavy and permanent. The steel benches were bolted to the floor, and the air smelled like ozone and old solder. It was a sterile, functional environment where the only light came from the flickering green monitors and the occasional spark from an exposed wire. In the dead of night, the silence between the hums of the machines was so profound that it felt like the room was holding its breath. Sam was 26 years old and was the kind of person who never left a question unanswered. He carried a small, leather-bound notebook in his back pocket at all times. In it, he recorded every observation, from the temperature of the cooling water to the exact time the janitor finished mopping the hallway. He didn't trust his memory, he trusted data. He was a man who saw the world as a series of complex equations to be solved. He wasn't much for social gatherings or campus parties. To Sam, a perfect Friday night was spent recalibrating a spectrometer or double-checking the math on a particle collision simulation. He had a calm, steady voice and hands that never shook, even when he was handling delicate equipment worth more than his childhood home. He was the anchor of his research group, the one everyone turned to when a project hit a wall. Every evening, Sam followed a process that was as predictable as the orbit of a planet. He would arrive at the lab at exactly 8 o'clock, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a turkey sandwich. He would spend the first 20 minutes checking the logs from the previous shift, making sure that every dial and every switch was in its correct position. He believed that even the smallest deviation could lead to a catastrophic error in his data. He would then begin the long, tedious process of aligning the high-powered lasers for his experiment. This required him to sit in a specialized chair for hours at a time, looking through a series of lenses. He would move the adjustment knobs by fractions of a millimeter, watching as a tiny red dot moved across a grid. He would do this over and over again until the dot was perfectly centered, not just once, but 10 times in a row. He liked the repetitive nature of the work. It was meditative. He would listen to the clicking of the knobs and the soft whirring of the cooling fans. He would count the number of times the red light pulsed against the wall. 1, 2, 3. It was a rhythm he knew by heart. While he worked, he would chew on the end of a pencil, lost in a world of photons and wave functions where everything behaved according to the rules. After the alignment was complete, he would record the results in his notebook using a fountain pen. He loved the way the ink looked on the paper, dark and permanent. He would then take a short break to eat his sandwich, sitting on a stool and staring out the window at the empty campus. He would watch the shadows of the trees move across the grass, thinking about how gravity and light were the only things that truly mattered. Then, he would head back to the console to begin the actual data collection. This part of the night was the quietest. He would dim the overhead lights to reduce electrical interference, leaving the room bathed in a soft, eerie glow from the equipment. He would sit there for 5 or 6 hours, barely moving, his eyes fixed on the scrolling graphs on his screen. It was a slow, deliberate stretch of time that he valued more than anything else. The shift happened on a humid Thursday night in August. Sam was in the middle of his 6th hour of data collection, the long, mundane stretch where most people would have started to nod off. He was watching the wave patterns on his primary monitor, a series of jagged lines that represented the energy levels of the particles he was tracking. Everything was perfectly normal. The lines were moving exactly as the theory predicted. But then, he noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible spike in the energy readings. It wasn't large enough to be an error, but it was there. It was a deviation from the pattern. Sam leaned in closer, his brow furrowed. He checked the cooling system, thinking it might be a thermal fluctuation, but the temperature was stable. He checked the power supply, but the voltage was steady. There was no logical reason for that spike to exist. He sat back and rubbed his eyes, thinking he might just be tired. But as he did, he felt a sudden change in the air pressure in the room. It was like the feeling you get right before a massive thunderstorm, a heavy, static charge that makes the hair on your arms stand up. He looked at his sensors, but they weren't showing anything unusual. Yet, he could feel it. A weight in the room that hadn't been there a minute ago. He turned his head slowly, looking toward the dark corner of the lab where the old storage crates were kept. He couldn't see anything, but he had the overwhelming sensation that he was no longer alone. It wasn't a feeling of fear, not yet. It was just a feeling of wrongness, like a piece of furniture had been moved while his back was turned. Something in the geometry of the room had shifted, and his brain was struggling to catch up. You are sitting in that high-backed chair, surrounded by millions of dollars of equipment that is designed to detect the smallest movements in the universe. You are a scientist. You do not believe in ghosts. You believe in cause and effect. But right now, every instinct in your body is screaming at you that there is a presence standing exactly 3 feet behind your left shoulder. Do you trust the machines that say the room is empty? Or do you trust the primitive part of your brain that is telling you to run? Because here is the thing. Sam didn't run. He did what a scientist does. He reached for his notebook to record the sensation, but as his fingers brushed the leather cover, he looked at the glass surface of his primary monitor. In the dark reflection of the screen, he didn't just see himself. He saw a man standing directly behind him. The man in the reflection was wearing an old-fashioned, heavy white lab coat, the kind they hadn't used at Harvard in 30 years. He was leaning over Sam's shoulder, staring at the energy graphs with an intensity that was terrifying. Sam, frozen. He didn't breathe. He watched the reflection as the man reached out a translucent hand and pointed at the exact spot on the screen where the energy spike had occurred. Sam spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the space behind him was completely empty. There was nothing but the cold concrete floor and the humming generators. He turned back to the monitor, and the reflection was gone. He was alone again. But when he looked down at his notebook, there was a smudge of gray ash on the page, exactly where his hand had been resting. It was the ash from a cigarette. The bizarre reveal came the next morning when Sam went to the university archives. He started digging through the old records of the Lyman laboratory, looking for any mention of an accident or a death. He found a photograph from 1952. In it, a group of researchers were standing in front of the very same console Sam used every night. And there, standing in the center, was the man from the reflection. His name was Professor Thomas Miller. He had been a brilliant physicist who was obsessed with the idea that human consciousness was a form of energy that could be measured after death. He had died of a sudden heart attack while working late one night, slumped over the very same desk where Sam sat. The energy spike Sam had seen wasn't a glitch in the machine. It was the exact frequency Miller had predicted in his final, unfinished notes. Sam never finished his thesis. He realized that there were things in that lab that he could measure, but that he would never truly understand. He transferred to a different university and changed his field of study to something far away from high-energy physics. He still keeps that notebook, but he never uses a fountain pen anymore. He says the ink reminds him too much of the shadows that wait in the dark. But while Sam was trying to forget the face in the reflection, hundreds of miles away in a dorm room at Ohio University, a young woman was about to find out that sometimes a face doesn't just appear in a reflection. Sometimes it gets carved into the very wood of the door you use every single day. And once a face is etched into the grain, it doesn't matter how many times you try to sand it away. Story 3. The Etched Face Room, 428, Ohio University. In the fall of 1978, a bright and social college student at Ohio University moved into Wilson Hall with high hopes for her junior year. She was an academic, a friend to everyone, and someone who was deeply interested in the boundary between life and death. She was exactly where she wanted to be, surrounded by the energy of a historic campus and the excitement of a new semester. She was doing exactly what any young person would do to start their future. But instead of attending her first lecture, she would be found dead in a room that had been sealed for years. The mystery is not just how she died, but why her face began to appear, etched permanently into the wood of the door, as if she was trying to look back out at the world she had left behind. The mystery is why a room that was meant to be a place of study and sleep became a prison for a spirit that refused to be forgotten or erased by time or by the living. The air inside room 428 of Wilson Hall didn't just feel old, it felt heavy, like the atmosphere was being compressed by an invisible weight that sat right on top of your shoulders. It had a thick, cloying smell of antique oak and stale dust that seemed to burrow into your clothes. When you stepped over the threshold, the temperature would drop 5 degrees in a second, and your ears would pop as if you were suddenly deep under the water. In the dead of night, the silence in that hallway was absolute, broken only by a faint, rhythmic scratching sound that seemed to come from inside the grain of the wood itself. It wasn't the sound of a mouse or a structural settling. It was the sound of a fingernail dragging slowly across a dry surface. It was a sound that made the hair on your neck stand up because it felt deliberate. It felt like someone was trying to write a message from the other side of the door. Her name was Sarah, and she was 21 years old. She was the kind of person who could walk into a crowded room and make a dozen new friends before she even reached the other side. She was majoring in psychology and had a side interest in the occult, which was a popular topic on campus in the late 70s. She wasn't dark or gloomy, she was just curious. She believed that there were parts of the human mind that science hadn't fully mapped out yet. Sarah was known for her infectious laugh and her habit of carrying a stack of books everywhere she went. She worked part-time at the university library, and she took great pride in helping other students find exactly what they were looking for. She lived a very normal, grounded life. She called her mother every Sunday afternoon, she liked her coffee with exactly 2 sugars, and she had a collection of potted plants that she treated like her own children. Every afternoon after her classes were finished, Sarah followed a ritual that was the definition of mundane. She would walk up the 3 flights of stairs in Wilson Hall, her backpack heavy with textbooks. She would stop at the top of the landing to catch her breath, then walk down the long, dimly lit corridor. When she reached room 428, she would always perform a small, playful habit she had developed. She would tap 3 times on the wooden doorframe before she put her key in the lock. Tap, tap, tap. It was her way of saying hello to the room. She would then turn the heavy brass key, feeling the click of the mechanism, and push the door open. The first thing she would do was set her keys on the small wooden desk by the window. Then she would walk over to her plants and check the soil for moisture, one by one, with the tip of her index finger. She would spend the next hour organizing her notes for the next day. She would sit in her wooden chair, the one that creaked every time she shifted her weight. She would open her spiral notebook and begin writing in her neat, rounded script. She would use a black ink pen, and she would underline important terms with a ruler. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only thing you could hear in the room for hours. Then she would start her evening chores. She would fold her laundry, making sure every shirt was perfectly aligned. She would sweep the floor, starting from the corners and moving toward the center. She would then make herself a cup of tea using a small electric kettle. She would wait for the whistle, pour the water, and let the tea steep for exactly 4 minutes. She found comfort in these repetitive, small actions. They made the world feel safe. Before she went to sleep, she would always stand by the window and look out at the campus. She would watch the streetlights flicker on and the shadows of the old buildings stretch across the quad. She would then lock her door, jiggle the handle to make sure it was secure, and climb into bed. She would pull the blankets up to her chin and listen to the building settle. It was a peaceful, boring routine that she expected to repeat for the rest of the year. The shift happened on a rainy Tuesday night in October. Sarah had just finished her tea and was about to get into bed when she noticed something on the back of the heavy oak door. It was a tiny, pale mark in the wood, right near the center. It looked like a small scratch, about an inch long. Sarah ran her thumb over it, thinking she must have accidentally hit it with her backpack earlier that day. She didn't think much of it and went to sleep. But the next morning, when she went to leave for her 8 o'clock lecture, the scratch had changed. It was no longer a single line. It had branched out. There were now several small, jagged grooves in the wood that hadn't been there the night before. And as she looked closer, she realized that the grain of the wood around the scratches seemed to be darkening, as if it were being stained from the inside. It looked almost like a bruise forming on a piece of fruit. She touched the wood, expecting it to feel rough, but it was perfectly smooth. The marks were beneath the surface of the finish. She felt a slight prickle of unease, but she brushed it off as a trick of the light. She locked the door and went to class. But throughout the day, she couldn't shake the image of those marks. They didn't look like accidental damage. They looked like they were forming a pattern. They looked like they were forming a shape. When she returned that evening, she didn't tap on the doorframe. She just stood there, staring at the door. The marks had grown again. They were now several inches wide, and the dark staining had spread. It was starting to look like a pair of eyes. 2 hollow, dark ovals in the middle of the oak panel. Sarah felt a wave of cold air wash over her, even though the hallway was warm. She felt like the door was looking at her. She felt like the room was no longer hers. You are standing in that narrow hallway. You have your keys in your hand, and you are looking at a piece of wood that seems to be transforming into a face right before your eyes. Every logical part of your brain tells you that it is just a natural variation in the wood grain, but your heart is pounding, and your skin is crawling. Do you open that door and go inside? Or do you sleep in the common room, admitting that you are afraid of a piece of furniture? Because here is the thing. Sarah was a psychology major. She didn't want to admit that she was being irrational. She opened the door. She went inside. She locked it behind her. But that night, she didn't do her chores. She didn't drink her tea. She just sat on her bed and watched the door in the moonlight. And as the hours passed, she watched as the grain of the wood slowly, agonizingly, twisted itself into the perfect likeness of a screaming human face. The bizarre reveal came after Sarah was found dead the next morning. There were no signs of a struggle, there was no poison in her system. The official report said her heart had simply stopped from extreme stress. But when the maintenance crew came to clear out her belongings, they couldn't help but notice the door. The face wasn't just a pattern in the grain anymore. It was a deep, three-dimensional etching. And it wasn't just any face. It was Sarah's face. The university tried everything to fix it. They sanded the door down until the wood was thin, but the face just appeared deeper in the grain. They painted over it with 3 layers of thick white paint, but the face bled through within 24 hours. Finally, they removed the door entirely and replaced it with a brand new one. But the next week, the face appeared on the new door too. It was as if the room itself was demanding that Sarah's image be seen by everyone who passed by. Wilson Hall, room 428, was eventually sealed with bricks and mortar. It is no longer listed on any campus map, and the hallway has been remodeled to hide where the entrance used to be. But students still claim they can hear the sound of 3 taps on the wall if they stand in the right spot at midnight. Sarah's story became a legend, a reminder that some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed, and some faces can never be erased. But while the university was trying to bury the memory of Sarah 200 miles away in the secret labs of Tennessee, a group of nuclear engineers were dealing with a different kind of haunting. They were dealing with a figure they called the Gray Man, a shadow that didn't appear on doors, but appeared in the steam of the cooling towers right before something went wrong. And unlike Sarah, the Gray Man wasn't looking for a friend. He was looking for a way to stop the end of the world. Story 4. The Gray Sentinel Oak Ridge National Lab. In the mid-1990s, a veteran safety engineer named David worked at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. He was a man of absolute logic, a specialist in nuclear containment who believed that every problem had a mechanical cause and a mathematical solution. He had spent 20 years maintaining an unblemished safety record in one of the most dangerous facilities on Earth. He was exactly where he wanted to be, serving as the ultimate line of defense. But instead of identifying a hardware failure through his sensors, David would receive a warning from something that shouldn't have existed in a place built on pure science. He would encounter a figure known in whispers as the Gray Man, a shadow that appeared only when death was imminent. The mystery is not just how a ghost could know about a microscopic crack in a steel pipe, but why this entity seemed so desperate to save a world that had long since forgotten its name. The air inside the lower levels of the Extend Graphite Reactor building didn't just feel still, it felt heavy with the weight of decades of secrets and the faint, persistent hum of power that vibrated in your very marrow. It had a sharp ozone smell that tasted like electricity on the back of your tongue, mixed with the damp mineral scent of deep concrete. When you walked through the lead-lined doors, the silence was so thick it felt like it was pressing against your eardrums. In the deepest parts of the facility, the lighting was a dim, sickly yellow that created long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance just out of the corner of your eye. Every footstep on the steel grating echoed with a hollow, metallic clang that traveled hundreds of feet down the service tunnels. It was a place where the machines never slept, and the low-frequency drone of the cooling pumps became a heartbeat that you eventually stopped hearing but never stopped feeling. David was 52 years old and was the kind of man who checked his watch against the atomic clock every single morning. He wore a crisp, short-sleeved, button-down shirt with a plastic pocket protector that held 3 different colors of pens. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy or ghost stories. He believed in the structural integrity of steel and the reliability of redundant systems. He was a father of 2 who spent his weekends meticulously restoring old clocks. He loved the way things worked when they were properly maintained. He found a deep sense of peace in the predictable ticking of a well-oiled gear or the steady glow of a green status light. David was the person the younger engineers went to when they couldn't find a leak. He had a way of listening to the machines, of feeling the vibrations in the floorboards, to know if a turbine was slightly out of balance. He was a man of the physical world, through and through. Every Tuesday night, David performed a solo inspection of the secondary cooling loops, a task that was as monotonous as it was critical. He would start at the north bulkhead at exactly 11 o'clock, carrying a heavy industrial flashlight and a clipboard. He would walk the entire length of the 3-mile tunnel system, stopping at every junction to manually verify the pressure gauges. He didn't trust the remote sensors. He trusted his own 2 eyes and his own hands. He would shine his light on the thick, insulated pipes, looking for the slightest hint of condensation or salt buildup. He would touch the metal, feeling for the specific warmth that indicated a healthy flow. He would record the numbers in his ledger with a mechanical pencil, his handwriting small and precise. He would do this for 4 hours, moving through the labyrinth of steel and concrete with a rhythmic, steady pace that had become a second nature over the decades. He liked the solitude of the tunnels. It was the only time he could truly think without the distraction of ringing phones or frantic meetings. He would count the number of rivets on the access hatches as he passed them. 42, 48, 56. It was a mental exercise that kept him sharp. While he walked, he would whistle a low, tuneless melody that bounced off the walls, a small human sound in a world built for machines. It was a safe, boring routine. After finishing the 3rd loop, he would take a seat on a small wooden crate near the emergency exit. He would open a small thermos of lukewarm tea and eat a single oatmeal cookie his wife had packed for him. He would watch the dust motes dance in the beam of his flashlight, thinking about the millions of atoms splitting just a few hundred feet above his head. He found comfort in the order of it all. He believed that as long as he followed the rules, the world would stay in balance. Then, he would begin the long walk back to the surface. He would check the primary valves one last time, feeling the vibration of the water rushing through the pipes. He would listen for the specific pitch of the pumps, a sound he described as a low B flat. If the pitch changed, even by a fraction, he would know something was wrong. But for 20 years, the pitch had stayed the same. It was a constant, a guarantee that the night was ending exactly as it should. The shift happened on a freezing Tuesday in January, right around 2 in the morning. David was deep in the heart of Loop B when he noticed a smudge on the glass of the main pressure gauge. It was a small, gray blur that looked like a fingerprint, which was impossible because no one else had been in this section for weeks. He reached out to wipe it away, but as his hand got close, he realized the smudge wasn't on the outside of the glass. It was a shadow cast from behind him. He turned around, expecting to see a security guard or a stray technician, but the tunnel was empty. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, revealing nothing but the long silver pipes and the damp concrete walls. He felt a sudden, sharp drop in the air temperature, a cold so intense it felt like he had stepped into a freezer. And then, he saw him. Standing at the very end of the light's reach was a man in a gray, old-fashioned lab coat. The man wasn't moving. He was just standing there, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He didn't have a face, or at least David couldn't see one in the flickering light. He was just a shape, a silhouette made of gray smoke and old memories. David froze, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. He tried to speak, to ask for identification, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. The figure didn't respond. It simply raised a hand and pointed. The gray hand was pointing directly at a section of the floor where the main steam line disappeared into the concrete. David looked down, then back up, but the figure was gone. The tunnel was empty once again, and the temperature began to climb back to normal. David shook his head, telling himself it was just a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the low-frequency hum of the lab. He turned to keep walking, but his foot slipped on something wet. You are standing in a dark tunnel, miles underground, in a facility that could level the state if something goes wrong. You have just seen a ghost, a literal specter that shouldn't exist. Your brain is screaming that you are losing your mind. Do you ignore what you saw and finish your shift so you can go home to your family? Or do you trust a shadow and report a problem that your multi-million-dollar sensor array says doesn't exist? Because here is the thing. David was a man of logic, and the most logical thing to do was to check the spot where the figure had pointed. He knelt down on the wet floor and shined his light on the base of the steam pipe. At first, he saw nothing. But then, he saw a tiny, microscopic bubble forming in the seam of the weld. It was a hairline fracture, a flaw so small that no sensor could detect it, but it was leaking high-pressure steam that would have eventually cut through the pipe like a laser. The bizarre reveal came after the emergency repair was completed. David went to the lab's archives and looked through the personnel files from the 1940s, back when the facility was part of the Manhattan Project. He found a photo of a man named James Miller, a safety inspector who had been killed in a steam explosion in the very same tunnel in 1945. In the photo, James was wearing the exact same gray lab coat, and he was holding a clipboard just like David's. But the most chilling part wasn't the photo, it was the location of the explosion. James hadn't died from a random accident. He had died while trying to manually close a valve during a test that had gone wrong, saving the lives of dozens of scientists in the levels above. He had been a hero that history had forgotten, a man who had given his life to prevent a catastrophe. And 50 years later, he was still on the job, still walking the tunnels, still pointing out the flaws that everyone else missed. David retired shortly after that night. He told his superiors he was tired, but the truth was that he couldn't stand the feeling of being watched by a man who had already given everything. He moved to a small town and spent his days fixing clocks far away from the hum of nuclear reactors. He still whistles that tuneless melody, but sometimes he catches himself looking at the shadows in the corner of the room, wondering if James is still out there, keeping the world safe. But while David was finding peace in the quiet of the Tennessee mountains, halfway across the world in the bustling city of Saigon, a young laboratory technician was starting her night shift at Cho-Ray Hospital. She didn't believe in the gray man or the secrets of the Manhattan Project. She believed in the blood samples and the chemical reagents in front of her, but as the clock struck midnight, she was about to find out that hospitals have their own set of silent observers. Story 5. The Midnight Rounds Cho-Ray Hospital Lab. In the heart of District 5 in Saigon, Vietnam, a 24-year-old laboratory technician named Lon was starting her usual night shift at Cho-Ray Hospital. She was a rising star in her department, a meticulous professional who took immense pride in the accuracy of her results. She had a stable life, a family she supported with her hard-earned salary, and a bright future in the medical field. She was exactly where any ambitious young woman in the city wanted to be. But instead of finishing a routine set of blood panels, Lan would find herself caught in a terrifying game of hide-and-seek with something that did not belong in the world of the living. She would encounter a phantom medical gurney that seemed to move on its own, guided by a force that logic could not explain. The mystery is not just why a machine would move without a driver, but why it chose to stop at her door on the very night she processed a sample that shouldn't have existed. The air inside the basement laboratory of Cho-Ray Hospital didn't just feel stagnant, it felt ancient, thick with the heavy, clinical scent of industrial-strength bleach and the faint, sweet smell of jasmine incense drifting in from the small altars tucked into the corners of the hallways. It was a cold, sterile environment where the fluorescent lights hummed with a low, buzzing frequency that felt like it was vibrating inside your skull. Every breath you took tasted like iron. In the middle of the night, the silence in the corridor of silence near the old morgue was so absolute that it became a physical presence. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet and the occasional sharp crack of the building settling into its foundation. It was a place where the darkness in the corners seemed to have a weight of its own, and the long, white-tiled hallways looked like they stretched on for an eternity into the shadows. Lan was the kind of person who never cut corners. She wore a lab coat that was always bleached to a blinding white, and she kept her hair pulled back in a tight, efficient bun. She wasn't someone who believed in the local superstitions about the hospital being haunted. To her, a hospital was a place of science and biology. She believed in things she could see through a microscope lens. She spent her free time studying advanced hematology and helping her younger siblings. She had a small desk in the corner of the lab where she kept a single framed photograph of her mother. Every night, she would wipe the dust off the frame before she started her work. She was a woman of routine, a woman who found comfort in the predictable nature of chemical reactions and cellular structures. She was the person the senior doctors trusted when they needed a second opinion on a difficult case. She was grounded, rational, and completely unprepared for the impossible. Every night, at precisely 11:45, Lan began a process that was the very definition of repetitive. She would gather the late-night blood samples from the intake box, checking each label twice to ensure the names and dates were correct. She would then move to the centrifuge, a heavy, cream-colored machine that looked like it belonged in a 1970s space program. She would carefully balance the glass tubes, placing them in their metal sleeves with a steady hand. She would wait for the machine to reach its full speed, listening to the high-pitched whine that eventually leveled off into a steady, hypnotic drone. While the samples spun, she would prepare the slides. She would take a clean glass square, place a single microscopic drop of reagent on it, and then set it aside to dry. She did this dozens of times every single night. 1, 2, 3, 4. She never rushed, and she never made a mistake. It was a rhythmic, calming ritual. She would then use a small silver pipette to transfer the serum. She loved the precision of it, the way the liquid moved in response to the slightest pressure of her thumb. She would then sit at her microscope and begin the long process of counting cells. She would move the slide back and forth, clicking a manual counter every time she saw a specific type of white blood cell. Click, click, click. The sound of the counter was the heartbeat of her night, a steady, boring pulse. She would record her findings in a thick ledger using a blue ink pen. She liked the way the ink felt on the paper, the way it made her work permanent. After finishing a batch, she would clean her station with a solution of 70% isopropyl alcohol. She would wipe the counter in small, circular motions, starting from the back and moving toward the front. She found peace in the cleanliness. She believed that as long as her lab was in order, her life would be too. Before her break at 3 in the morning, she would always walk to the end of the hallway to check the temperature of the storage freezers. She would walk past the old, unused gurneys that were lined up against the wall, their chrome frames glinting in the dim light. She would count them as she went. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were always in the same spot, their wheels locked, their leather pads dusty and cracked. It was a safe, predictable world of steel and glass. The shift happened on a humid Tuesday in July. Lan was in the middle of her third batch of samples when she noticed that the heavy medical gurney at the end of the hall, the one with the squeaky wheel that everyone complained about, was no longer in its spot. It had moved about 5 feet forward. Lan paused, thinking a janitor must have bumped it. She walked over, pushed it back into place, and made sure the wheel locks were engaged. She didn't think about it again. But 40 minutes later, when she went to get a fresh cup of tea, the gurney was out in the middle of the hallway. It wasn't just bumped. It was positioned as if someone was currently pushing it toward the morgue elevators. Lan felt a cold prickle of sweat on her lower back. She looked around, but the corridor was completely empty. There were no footsteps, no voices, and the heavy security doors at the far end were still locked. The silence was heavier than usual. She pushed the gurney back a second time, but as she did, she realized that the leather pad on top was warm. It wasn't just room temperature, it was the specific, lingering warmth of a human body that had just been lying there. Lan's hand recoiled, as if she had been burned. She stood there in the buzzing light, her heart starting to race. She looked at the floor, but there were no scuff marks. There was nothing to explain how a 100-pound piece of metal had moved on its own. She hurried back to her lab and locked the door. She sat at her microscope, trying to focus on the slides, but all she could hear was the low hum of the centrifuge. And then she heard it. From the other side of the heavy wooden door, there was a faint metallic squeak, the sound of a single wheel that needed oil. It was moving slowly, rhythmically, coming from the far end of the hallway toward her office. Squeak. Pause. Squeak. Pause. It was getting closer with every breath. You are sitting in that small, locked room. You are surrounded by the tools of science, by things that are supposed to make sense. But out in that hallway, something is moving toward you, and you know for a fact that there is no one there to push it. Do you open the door and confront the logic of your world, or do you hide under the desk, admitting that the stories you laughed at might be true? Because here is the thing. Lan didn't hide. She was a scientist. She walked to the door, grabbed the handle, and threw it open. The hallway was empty. But the gurney, the one she had locked in place twice, was now sitting directly in front of her door, and on the leather pad, there was a single, fresh blood sample vial. It was labeled with a name she recognized, a doctor from the surgical wing named Min. Lan picked up the vial, her fingers trembling. She knew Dr. Min. He had been her mentor. He was supposed to be on vacation. The bizarre reveal came when Lan took the vial back to her station and looked up Dr. Min's records in the hospital system. She found his name, but there was a red flag on the file. Doctor. Min hadn't been on vacation. He had been involved in a massive car accident 2 hours before Lan's shift started. He had been brought into the emergency room and pronounced dead on arrival at exactly 12:45, the very same time Lan had first noticed the gurney move. The blood in the vial wasn't a routine sample. It was a perfect, typed match for Dr. Min, but according to the records, no one had drawn his blood after the accident. He had been taken directly to the morgue. Lan realized that the gurney wasn't just moving, it was making a final round. It was delivering the last piece of data from a man who had spent his entire life dedicated to the same science that Lan loved. The gurney was doing exactly what it was built to do. Lan left the hospital that morning and never went back to the night shift. She eventually moved to a private clinic where the hallways were bright and the equipment was brand new. She still works with blood samples, but she never stays in the lab after the sun goes down. She says that once you've heard the squeak of a phantom wheel, you never stop listening for it. You realize that even in a world of microscopes and ledgers, there are some things that can't be measured. But while Lan was finding a new path in Saigon, thousands of miles away in a quiet laboratory in Paris, the ghost of a different kind of scientist was still making her presence known. Marie Curie had been gone for decades, but her research was so powerful that it had left a permanent mark on the world. And in the dark of her former office, the papers were about to start lettrang by themselves, because some work is so important that even death cannot bring it to an end. Story 6. The Blue Glow, Curie Institute. The air inside the basement archives of the Curie Institute in Paris does not feel like a normal room. It feels electric, like the atmosphere just before a massive lightning strike. There is a very faint, almost imperceptible hum that you do not hear with your ears, but feel in the very back of your jaw. It has a metallic, ozone-like scent that stays on your clothes long after you leave, a smell that is both clean and incredibly dangerous at the same time. In the total darkness of the lead-lined storage vaults, something impossible happens. If you sit there long enough and let your eyes adjust, you will start to see a soft, ethereal blue light emanating from the shelves. It is not a reflection, and it is not a glow-in-the-dark toy. It is the literal light of atoms tearing themselves apart. It is a beautiful, ghostly luminescence that has been shining for over 90 years, a light that belonged to Marie Curie. Jean-Pierre was 58 years old and had spent 30 years working as a senior archivist at the Institute. He was a man of immense patience and a profound respect for the past. He wore a dark wool vest and a pair of spectacles that were always perched on the very tip of his nose. He lived a quiet life in a small apartment overlooking the Seine, and his greatest joy was the careful preservation of scientific history. He was a man of the physical and the tangible. He believed that every object told a story, and it was his job to make sure those stories were never lost to time. Jean-Pierre was the kind of person who would spend 3 days researching the exact type of ink used in a 19th century letter. He was methodical, grounded, and completely focused on the logic of history. He was exactly where he wanted to be, surrounded by the greatest scientific minds in French history, doing work that felt truly meaningful and permanent. Every Monday morning, Jean-Pierre followed a safety protocol that was as strict as any military operation. He would arrive at the Institute at exactly 7:30, greet the security staff with a polite nod, and head to the locker room. He would remove his street clothes and put on a specialized white protective suit. He would then step into a thick pair of lead-lined boots and pull on 2 pairs of latex gloves, securing the cuffs with heavy industrial tape. He would spend 10 minutes checking his dosimeter, a small device that measured radiation levels, making sure the calibration was perfect. He didn't fear the radiation, he respected it. To him, the invisible energy was just another part of the archival process. He would then enter the high-security vault, a room with walls 3 feet thick made of solid lead and concrete. He would walk to the first shelf, his heavy boots echoing with a dull, muffled thud on the floor. His primary task was the cataloging of Marie Curie's original research notebooks. Because these books are still highly radioactive, he could only handle one at a time. He would carefully lift a notebook from its lead-lined box, moving with a slowness that was almost agonizing to watch. He would place the book on a specialized scanning table behind a thick pane of leaded glass. He would then use a pair of long mechanical tongs to turn the pages one by one. He would spend hours just looking at the handwriting. Marie's script was elegant, precise, and filled with a sense of urgency. He would count the number of times she crossed out a word or added a note in the margins. 1, 2, 3. Every mark was a piece of a puzzle. He would record the catalog number in a digital ledger, then describe the condition of the paper, the color of the ink, and the radiation reading for that specific page. It was a slow stretch. While he worked, he would listen to the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the ventilation system. It was the only sound in the vault, a constant whoosh of filtered air that never changed. He would count the turns of the mechanical tongs: left, right, grip, release. He liked the repetitive nature of the work. It allowed him to enter a state of total concentration where the outside world ceased to exist. He was alone with the thoughts of a genius, separated only by glass. He would then take a short break, sitting on a small stool in the decontamination chamber. He would sip water from a small plastic cup and stare at the heavy steel door. He would think about how these same papers had once sat on a wooden desk in a drafty shed, being handled by a woman who had no idea they would one day be locked in a tomb of lead. He found a strange comfort in that continuity. He believed that order was the only way to honor the chaos of discovery. Before leaving for the day, he would return the notebook to its box and lock it with a specialized key. He would then perform a final sweep of the workspace, looking for any tiny fragments of paper or dust that might have escaped. He would wipe down the leaded glass with a special solution, moving the cloth in perfectly vertical strokes. It was a safe, predictable routine that he had performed thousands of times without a single variation. It was his world of logic. The shift happened on a rainy Wednesday in November, right around 4 o'clock. Jean-Pierre was finishing his cataloging of notebook number 5 when he realized he had forgotten to record the radiation level for page 82. He turned back to the scanning table, but as he did, he noticed that the tongs were already in motion. They weren't being held by him, yet the mechanical handles were moving as if an invisible pair of hands was operating them from the other side. Jean-Pierre froze. He watched as the tongs gripped the corner of the page and gently, precisely, turned it back to page 82. He felt a sudden, sharp drop in the air pressure, a sensation that made his ears pop. He looked at the dosimeter on his wrist, and the numbers were climbing rapidly, far higher than they should have been for a single notebook. And then he saw the light. The faint blue glow was no longer coming from the shelf, it was on the table. The blue light began to take a shape, a soft, shimmering outline of a woman leaning over the notebook. She was wearing a high-collared dress from the early 1900s, and her hair was pulled back in a loose bun. She wasn't solid, but she was there. Jean-Pierre felt a sensation of pins and needles all over his skin, a static charge so strong it made his hair stand up inside his hood. He realized he was looking at Marie Curie, and she was still working. The figure didn't look up. She was focused entirely on the page. She held an invisible pen, and she was making a correction in the margin of a formula that Jean-Pierre had looked at 100 times. As he watched, the ink on the physical page began to darken and shift as if it were being rewritten by a ghost. Jean-Pierre's heart was hammering against his ribs, and his breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. He couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the impossible. You are standing in that lead-lined room. You are a man of science, a man of history, and you are currently witnessing a woman who has been dead for nearly a century rewrite a scientific law right in front of your eyes. The radiation alarm on your wrist is screaming, warning you that the energy in the room is reaching a lethal level. Do you run for the exit and save your own life? Or do you stay and witness the greatest scientific discovery of your career? Because here is the thing. Jean-Pierre didn't run. He leaned in. He watched as the figure finished the calculation, laid down the invisible pen, and then turned her head slowly to look at him through the leaded glass. Her eyes weren't filled with fear or anger. They were filled with a calm, eternal curiosity. She offered a small, knowing smile, and then the blue light intensified until it was a blinding flash. A second later, the room was dark and the figure was gone. The bizarre reveal came when Jean-Pierre finally worked up the courage to examine page 82 after the radiation levels stabilized. The correction wasn't just a smudge or a hallucination. There was a new line of ink, perfectly matching Marie's handwriting, that solved a fundamental error in her late-stage research on radioactive isotopes. It was a missing piece of the puzzle that modern scientists had been trying to figure out for decades. The ghost wasn't haunting the institute, she was finishing her work. Jean-Pierre retired a year later. He never told his supervisors the truth about what happened, knowing they would think he had suffered from radiation-induced hallucinations. He told them he had found the correction during a routine scan. He moved back to his small apartment and spent his days reading books that had nothing to do with science. But every night, before he goes to sleep, he looks at his hands, wondering if they still hold a trace of that beautiful, deadly blue light. The legacy of the Curie Institute remains, a place where the past and the future are separated only by a thin sheet of lead. But while Jean-Pierre was finding peace in Paris, thousands of miles away in the desert of New Mexico, a group of scientists were about to learn that radiation isn't always a helpful ghost. Sometimes it is a demon that waits for you to make a single, tiny mistake. And in the labs of Los Alamos, the Demon Corps was about to show them exactly how cruel the light can be. Story 7. The Demon's Touch, Los Alamos. In the late summer of 1945, a brilliant young physicist named Harry Daghlian was working at the top-secret Los Alamos laboratory in the high desert of New Mexico. He was a rising star in the Manhattan Project, a man who understood the fundamental building blocks of the universe better than almost anyone else his age. He was a careful researcher with a bright future and everything to live for. He was exactly where he wanted to be, serving at the cutting edge of science. But instead of completing his latest experiment and heading home for a well-deserved rest, Harry would accidentally trigger a blinding blue flash of radiation that would cook his body from the inside out in a matter of seconds. The mystery is not just how a man so skilled could make a single fatal mistake, but why, after his death, the object he was working on seemed to develop a malevolent life of its own, reaching out to touch anyone who dared to get too close to its power. The silence inside the Omega Site laboratory was so profound that it felt like a physical weight against your ears. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic scratching of a pencil on a clipboard and the faint, distant hum of a cooling fan that never seemed to stop. The air smelled of dry desert dust and the sharp chemical tang of high explosives stored nearby. It was a cold, clinical environment where every surface was polished to a dull shine. Then, in an instant, the world turned blue. It wasn't a light you saw with your eyes, it was a light that you felt in your very bones, accompanied by a sudden, searing wave of heat that felt like stepping into a blast furnace. It was a beautiful, deadly, electric glow that signaled the end of everything. A metallic taste, like you had been sucking on a copper penny, filled your mouth instantly. It was the smell of ozone and the feeling of the very air around you being torn apart by a force that humans were never meant to touch. Harry Daghlian was only 24 years old, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man twice his age. He was a graduate student from Purdue University who had been handpicked for the most important scientific project in human history. Harry was a kind, soft-spoken man who loved playing the violin and writing long, detailed letters to his mother back in Connecticut. He was the kind of person who would spend hours explaining complex physics to anyone who asked. He had a steady hand, a sharp mind, and a future that everyone in the lab expected to lead to a Nobel Prize. He was a man of the physical world, a man of logic, and a man who believed that nature could be tamed if you just followed the rules of mathematics. He spent his free time hiking in the mountains, enjoying the simple beauty of the New Mexico landscape. He was grounded, rational, and completely focused on the monumental task of bringing the atomic age to life. Every evening, Harry followed a protocol that was designed to keep him alive in the presence of a 6.2 kilogram sphere of plutonium. He would arrive at the lab at exactly 9 o'clock, long after the other scientists had gone home. He liked the quiet of the night shift. He would put on his white lab coat, adjust his glasses, and walk to the center of the room where the core sat on a small wooden table. He would begin the process of building a wall of tungsten carbide bricks. It was a slow, agonizingly precise task. He would pick up a brick, which weighed about 10 pounds, and place it carefully near the core. He had to be careful not to let the bricks touch the plutonium, as that would reflect the neutrons back into the metal and start a chain reaction. He would do this for hours, moving with the grace of a watchmaker. He would place a brick, measure the neutron count with a Geiger counter, and then record the number in his ledger. 1, 2, 3. He would move the sensor back and forth, listening to the steady, rhythmic clicking of the machine. It was a hypnotic sound, a boring pulse, that measured the heartbeat of the atom. He would count the number of bricks in each layer, making sure the geometry was perfect. He found a deep sense of peace in the repetition. He believed that as long as he was careful, the dragon would stay asleep. He would whistle a low, slow tune while he worked. It was a safe, predictable world. After finishing the first few layers, he would take a moment to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He would check the temperature of the room, ensuring it stayed within the strict parameters required for the experiment. He would then pick up the next brick, feeling the rough texture of the tungsten against his gloves. He would lower it into place, millimeter by millimeter, his eyes fixed on the gap between the brick and the sphere. It was a dance with death that he performed every night. The shift happened on a Tuesday night in August, just as he was placing the final brick of the day. Harry was tired, his muscles aching from the weight of the tungsten, when he felt a sudden, subtle change in the air. It wasn't a sound or a smell, but a feeling of intense static electricity, like the air was being pulled toward the center of the room. He looked at the Geiger counter, and for a split second, the needle didn't move. It just sat there, frozen at the very top of the scale. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his hands, a feeling like thousands of tiny needles were dancing on his skin. He realized that he had moved the final brick just a fraction of an inch too close. The geometry was no longer safe. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself was trying to push him away from the table. It was a quiet, terrifying shift in the fundamental laws of his environment. The dragon wasn't just waking up, it was already reaching out to touch him. You are standing over that small wooden table in the middle of a desert laboratory. You are holding a heavy gray brick in your right hand, and your left hand is resting just inches away from a sphere of plutonium that is currently beginning to glow. Suddenly, the brick slips from your sweaty fingers. You watch in slow motion as it falls toward the core. Your heart isn't just beating fast, it is slamming against your ribs like a hammer. You reach out to grab the brick, but you are too late. A blinding flash of blue light fills the room, and you feel a wave of heat so intense it feels like your blood is starting to boil inside your veins. Your hand goes numb, and that copper taste fills your mouth. You know instantly what has happened. You have just received a lethal dose of radiation. Your body is still moving, and you can still see the room around you, but for all intents and purposes, you are already a ghost. You have reached the point of no return in a split second. You are alone in that silent lab, and the only sound is the frantic, high-pitched scream of the radiation alarm. Do you drop the brick and run for the exit, hoping that maybe the dose wasn't high enough to kill you? Or do you reach back into that deadly, glowing field with your bare hands and pull the brick away, knowing that every extra second you spend there is another nail in your coffin? You know that if you don't stop the reaction, it will kill everyone else in the building. Because here is the thing, Harry didn't run. He reached into the blue glow and knocked the brick off the table with his bare hand, stopping the reaction instantly. He saved the facility and his colleagues, but he knew exactly what it had cost him. He walked out of the room, sat down on a quiet bench in the hallway, and waited for the security teams to find him. He was a man of logic until the very end, calculating his own remaining hours as he sat there in the dark. The bizarre reveal came after Harry died 25 days later in a hospital bed, his body literally falling apart as the radiation destroyed his DNA. The plutonium sphere, now nicknamed the Demon Core, was supposed to be sent to the Pacific for a test, but before it could leave, another scientist named Louis Slotin was killed by it in an almost identical accident. After the second death, the lab workers began to report something they could not explain with their instruments. They claimed that when they walked past the storage vault where the core was kept, they would feel a sudden, invisible hand push them away from the heavy steel door. Others reported seeing a young man in a white lab coat standing by the core in the middle of the night. His hands reached out as if he was trying to hold the tungsten bricks in place. The core wasn't just a piece of metal anymore, it was haunted by the men who had died trying to tame the power inside of it. The demon core was eventually melted down and its material was recycled. But the stories of the pushed guards and the phantom violin music in the Omega Site tunnels persisted for decades. Harry Daghlian became a tragic hero, a reminder of the thin line between discovery and destruction. But while the scientists in New Mexico were dealing with a spirit that tried to push them away from danger, halfway across the world in the Philippines, a group of students was about to meet a ghost. This spirit didn't push people away, She was known for staying behind in the anatomy labs to help students finish their work before the morning exams. And in the crowded, humid halls of the University of the Philippines, having a ghost as a lab partner was about to become a terrifying reality for one young woman who stayed just a little bit too late. She was about to find out that sometimes the dead are much more helpful than the living, even if their touch is cold. Story 8. The Anatomy Partner. Up Dillaman. In the sweltering rainy season of 1992, a second-year medical student named Maria was cramming for her final practical exam at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She was a brilliant and driven student, a young woman who had sacrificed every weekend and every social outing to maintain her standing at the top of her class. She was exactly where she needed to be, working in a historic institution to build a future that would save countless lives in her home country. But instead of mastering the complex network of the human nervous system, Maria would encounter a teacher she never expected to see in an anatomy lab. She would find herself face to face with a cadaver that did not just lay there, but seemed to actively participate in her education. The mystery is not just how a body preserved in chemicals could move, but why it chose to reveal a truth that the police had been searching for during the last 2 weeks of a terrifying missing person case. The air inside the anatomy laboratory in the basement of Palma Hall didn't just feel humid. It felt heavy with a thick, suffocating layer of formaldehyde that seemed to coat your skin and hair the moment you walked through the heavy wooden doors. It was a sharp, stinging scent that made your eyes water and your nose burn with every breath. The ventilation was provided by a single, massive overhead fan that spun with a slow, rhythmic creak that sounded like a long and painful groan. In the dead of night, the silence in the lab was broken only by the steady, persistent dripping of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the back. It was a hollow, echoing sound that bounced off the white-tiled walls and the stainless steel tables. The darkness in the corners of the room was absolute, illuminated only by a few flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a sickly, pale green light over the long rows of shrouded figures. Every movement you made felt like it was being watched. Maria was 22 years old and was the kind of person who never let a single detail slip through the cracks. She carried a thick, leather-bound atlas of human anatomy that was filled with her own meticulous drawings in 3 different colors of ink. She wasn't someone who was easily spooked by the dead. To her, a cadaver was the ultimate textbook, a final gift of knowledge from a stranger. She spent her nights in the lab because it was the only place she could truly find silence. She was a daughter of 2 teachers who had saved every centavo to send her to the best university in the country. She carried that weight with her every day, feeling a deep sense of responsibility to her family and her community. She was grounded, incredibly rational, and she believed that everything in the world could be explained by biology and physics. She was a woman of logic who found comfort in the order of the human body. She was completely focused on the work in front of her. Every night at precisely 10:30, Maria followed a routine that was the definition of academic discipline. She would enter the lab, put on her heavy rubber apron, and snap on a fresh pair of latex gloves. She would spend exactly 5 minutes organizing her tools on a small rolling tray. Scalpels, forceps, and probes were laid out in order of size. She believed that a messy workstation led to a messy mind, and she couldn't afford a single mistake on her upcoming exam. She would then walk to table number 14, where her assigned cadaver lay under a heavy plastic sheet. She would carefully pull back the cover, exposing only the section she intended to study that night. She would spend hours tracing the path of the brachial plexus, moving the muscles aside with the gentleness of a surgeon. She would speak the names of the nerves out loud in a low, steady whisper. Musculocutaneous, axillary, radial, median. It was a quiet and focused ritual. She would use a small magnifying glass to see the tiny branches of the arteries. She loved the complexity of it, the way everything was connected in a perfect, logical design. She would count the number of times a nerve branched before entering a muscle. 1, 2, 3. She would record her observations in her notebook using a mechanical pencil, her handwriting small and precise. She would do this for hours, oblivious to the passage of time or the growing shadows in the room. She would take a short break to stretch her back and drink some water from a small plastic bottle. She would look out at the dark campus through the high barred windows, watching the rain hit the leaves of the old acacia trees. She would then return to the table, check the moisture of the preservation fluid, and begin the next layer of the dissection. She found a strange sense of peace in the repetition. She believed that as long as she followed the atlas, she would find her way. Before leaving at 3 in the morning, she would carefully replace the plastic shroud and secure it with heavy clips. She would wash her tools in a basin of disinfectant, drying each one with a clean cloth before placing it back in her kit. She would then mop the area around her table, moving the mop in perfectly straight lines from the wall to the drain. It was a safe and predictable world of science and study that she had mastered over the course of her 2 years in med school. The shift happened on a stormy Tuesday night in late September. Maria was deep into the dissection of the neck and throat, a particularly difficult area, when she realized she couldn't find the superior laryngeal nerve. She consulted her atlas, then looked back at the cadaver, but the anatomy didn't seem to match the drawing. She paused, feeling a slight sense of frustration. She adjusted her lamp, bringing the light closer to the table, but the structures were still unclear. She reached for her forceps to move a layer of fascia, but as her hand moved toward the table, she noticed that the cadaver's right hand was no longer lying flat at its side. The fingers were slightly curled, as if they were about to grip the edge of the steel table. Maria stopped and took a deep breath. She told herself that it was just a natural muscle contraction caused by the cold or the chemicals. She moved the hand back to its original position and continued her work. But 10 minutes later, when she reached for her scalpel, the cadaver's hand was back. And this time, it wasn't just curled. One of the fingers was extended, pointing directly at a spot on the neck that Maria had overlooked. She felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She looked at the finger, then at the neck, and realized that there was a small, intentional incision already there, hidden deep under the muscle. It wasn't a natural part of the body. She felt a static charge in the air that made the hair on her arms stand up. The overhead fan seemed to slow down, its creaking becoming a heavy, rhythmic throb. Maria looked at the face of the cadaver, which was still covered by a small cloth, and she saw the fabric move. It was a tiny, subtle shift, as if someone underneath was taking a shallow breath. The silence in the room was now so thick that Maria could hear the blood rushing through her own ears like a distant ocean. You are standing in that dark basement, alone, with 40 dead bodies, and the one right in front of you is pointing out a forensic detail that isn't in your textbook. You are a scientist. You know that dead tissue cannot move. But you are looking at a moving finger. Do you run for the stairs and never look back? Or do you pull back that cloth and look at the face of the person who is trying to tell you a secret? Do you trust your logic, or do you trust what your eyes are telling you? Because here is the thing. Maria was a scientist, but she was also a friend. She recognized the ring on the cadaver's hand. It was a small gold band with a tiny green stone, the exact same one her classmate Elena always wore. Elena had been missing for 14 days. Maria's heart wasn't just beating fast, it was screaming in her chest. She reached out, her fingers trembling so hard she could barely move, and she pulled back the cloth from the cadaver's face. It was Elena. The bizarre reveal came when Maria realized that Elena wasn't supposed to be on that table. The cadaver assigned to table 14 was supposed to be a 70-year-old man who had died of natural causes. But someone had swapped the bodies. Elena hadn't disappeared. She had been murdered, and her body had been hidden in plain sight, preserved in a vat of formaldehyde to wait for a dissection that would eventually destroy all the evidence of how she had actually died. The finger wasn't just pointing at a nerve. It was pointing at a tiny crushed bone in the neck that proved she had been strangled. The ghost of Elena hadn't sat up to help Maria pass an exam. She had stayed behind to make sure her killer didn't get away with it. Maria called the police, and the subsequent investigation revealed that a lab assistant had killed Elena after she rejected him, thinking the anatomy lab was the one place no one would ever look for a fresh body. Maria graduated at the top of her class, but she didn't become a surgeon. She became a forensic pathologist, dedicated to giving a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. She never forgot the cold touch of that pointing finger or the way the green light looked on Elena's face. She says that sometimes the dead are the most honest teachers we will ever have. You just have to be brave enough to listen to what they are trying to show you in the silence of the night. But while Maria was uncovering the truth in the humid halls of Quezon City, thousands of miles away in the hills of Kentucky, a much larger facility was hiding its own secrets. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium was once a place of healing, but it became a laboratory for some of the most horrific experiments in medical history. And in the infamous room 502, a young nurse was about to find out that some secrets are so dark they can never be buried, no matter how deep you go. Story 9, The Nurse of Room 502 Waverly Hills. In the late 1920s, a 29-year-old nurse named Mary worked at the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky. She was known for her compassion, her steady hands, and her unwavering dedication to the tuberculosis patients who were often abandoned by the rest of the world. She had a respected position, a clear sense of purpose, and a reputation for being the most reliable staff member on the 4th floor. She was exactly where she wanted to be, doing the difficult work. But instead of finishing her morning rounds and heading to the mess hall for a well-earned breakfast, Mary would be found hanging from a light fixture in room 502, a place she had no medical reason to visit that morning. The mystery is not just how a woman so full of life could end it so abruptly, but why her spirit seems to still be on duty nearly a century later. The mystery is why she chose the highest, most isolated point of the building to leave it all behind. The air inside the 5th floor of Waverly Hills didn't just feel cold, it felt thick with the smell of wet limestone and the sharp, stinging scent of industrial-strength disinfectant that couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of decay. There was a constant, low whistle as the wind whipped through the open-air sunrooms, carrying the damp chill of the Kentucky hills deep into the stone corridors. When you stepped onto that floor, the silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against your chest. Every breath you took felt like you were inhaling graveyard dust, and the shadows in the long, arched hallways seemed to move independently of the light. In the dead of night, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of a heavy fire door swinging on its hinges and the faint, ghostly scratching of dry leaves across the concrete floors. It was a place where the darkness had a physical weight, and the very walls seemed to have absorbed the suffering of the thousands of people who died there. Mary was the kind of nurse who would stay past her shift just to hold a patient's hand during their final hours. She wore a starched white uniform that was always pristine, and her cap was pinned perfectly to her dark hair. She wasn't someone who complained about the grueling hours or the constant threat of infection. To her, nursing was a calling, a sacred duty to provide comfort to the hopeless. She lived in the nurses' quarters on the grounds and spent her few free hours reading poetry. She was a woman of habit and order, believing that a clean ward and a kind word were the best medicines a person could receive. She was grounded, incredibly rational, and she viewed the sanatorium as a place of science and recovery, not a place of death. She had a warm, steady laugh that could brighten even the darkest rooms on the 4th floor. She was the anchor for the younger nurses, the one they looked to for strength when the workload became too much to bear for anyone else. Every morning at precisely 5:30, Mary began a routine that was the definition of medical precision. She would start by checking the temperature logs for every patient in the West Wing. She would move from bed to bed, her footsteps muffled by her soft, rubber-soled shoes. She would adjust the pillows, check the IV lines, and make small, careful notes in her ledger using a black ink pen. She believed that even the smallest change in a patient's condition was vital information. She would spend the next 2 hours assisting with the morning treatments. This involved moving heavy oxygen tanks and helping patients into wheelchairs so they could be rolled out to the sunrooms. She would do this with a level of gentleness that was rare in such a crowded facility. She would count the number of breaths each patient took per minute, recording the data with a steady hand. 1, 2, 3. She never rushed, and she never made a mistake. It was a rhythmic, calming process. After the patients were settled, she would begin the long task of changing the bandages on those who had undergone experimental lung surgeries. She would peel back the old gauze with extreme care, cleaning the wounds with a solution of carbolic acid. She would then apply fresh dressings, securing them with white tape. She did this dozens of times every single shift. She liked the order of the supplies, the way the bandages were stacked neatly in their metal tins on the rolling cart. She would then spend an hour in the sterilization room washing the glass syringes and metal surgical tools. She loved the heat of the steam and the way the metal glinted after it was cleaned. She would count the tools as she placed them back into their cases. 12 scalpels, 6 forceps, 24 needles. It was a mental exercise that kept her focused. While she worked, She would hum a low, soft melody to herself, a small human sound in a world built for the sick and the dying. Before her morning break, she would always walk to the central staircase to check the supply inventory on the lower levels. She would walk past the heavy oak doors of the administration offices, her keys jingling softly at her waist. She would count the stairs as she went. 10, 20, 30. It was a safe, predictable routine that she had performed every day for 3 years. She believed that as long as she followed the rules of the sanatorium, nothing truly bad could ever happen to her. The shift happened on a gray Tuesday morning in 1928. Mary was finishing her inventory check when she noticed that the heavy steel door leading to the 5th floor was slightly ajar. The 5th floor was reserved for the most extreme cases and the living quarters for the staff with tuberculosis, and Mary had no patients assigned there. She paused, her hand hovering over the cold metal handle. She knew she should just close it and go back to her ward, but she felt a strange pull. As she looked through the gap, she saw a flicker of movement at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't the movement of a person. It was a shadow that seemed to stretch out from the walls, moving toward room 502. Mary felt a sudden, sharp drop in the air pressure, a sensation that made her heart start to race. She stepped through the door, and as she did, the heavy steel frame slammed shut behind her with a sound like a gunshot. She was now trapped on the 5th floor. She began to walk down the long, arched corridor, her footsteps sounding much louder than usual on the cold stone. The air felt heavy, as if it were filled with a static charge that made her skin crawl. She reached room 502 and pushed the door open. The room was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt crowded, as if 100 people were standing in the small space, all of them breathing in unison. Mary felt a pressure on her chest that made it hard to swallow. She looked up at the ceiling and saw a heavy iron light fixture. In that moment, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of despair that wasn't her own. It was a crushing weight of grief and hopelessness that seemed to pour out of the very walls of the room. She tried to turn and run, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. The silence in the room was now so absolute that she could hear the rhythmic thumping of her own heart, and it sounded like a heavy drum in the dark. You are standing in that small, square room at the very top of a massive building filled with thousands of dying people. You are a woman of science and compassion, but you are currently being overwhelmed by a darkness that you cannot explain with medicine. You feel an invisible force pulling you toward the center of the room, toward that iron fixture. Do you fight the urge to give up? Do you scream for help, knowing that no one on the floors below can hear you through the stone? Because here is the thing. Mary didn't scream. The people who found her later that morning said that her face was perfectly calm, as if she had simply decided to go to sleep. But the bizarre reveal came years later when the sanatorium was being closed down. A hidden compartment was found behind the baseboard in room 502. Inside was a diary, but it wasn't Mary's. It belonged to a doctor who had been performing illegal experiments on the patients on the 5th floor. The diary detailed how Mary had discovered his secrets just days before her death. She hadn't gone to that room to end her life. She had been lured there. The doctor had been using the room to hide evidence of his crimes, and he had realized that Mary was the only one who could stop him. He hadn't just killed her. He had staged the scene to look like a suicide to protect his own reputation. Mary had been a victim of the very system she had spent her entire life trying to serve and protect. But the real mystery began after the building was abandoned. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators began to report seeing a woman in a vintage white nurse's uniform standing in the window of room 502. They claimed that when they entered the room, they would feel a gentle, firm hand on their shoulder pushing them back toward the door. It wasn't a threatening gesture, it was a protective one. Mary was still on duty, still warning people to stay away. She was still trying to protect the living from the darkness that had claimed her life. The room remains one of the most haunted locations in America, a place where the air never warms up and the shadows never stop moving. Mary's story became a legend, a reminder that true dedication doesn't end with a final breath. She remains the silent guardian of Waverly Hills, a woman who gave everything to her patients and continues to give her spirit to those who wander too far into the dark. But while Mary was standing her watch in the hills of Kentucky, thousands of miles away in the frozen wasteland of Antarctica, a group of scientists were about to encounter a different kind of silence. At the McMurdo station, the isolation of the long polar night was about to drive a man to the edge of sanity. He was about to find out that when you are that far from the rest of humanity, the voices you hear in the wind aren't always in your head. Sometimes, the ice has a memory of its own. Story 10. The Antarctic Voices, McMurdo, Station. In the winter of 2018, a seasoned researcher named David was stationed at the McMurdo Station in Antarctica. He was a veteran of the ice, a man who thrived in the absolute isolation of the polar night. He had a stable life back in the States, a loving family, and a prestigious career in marine biology. He was exactly where he wanted to be. But instead of collecting data, he would find himself haunted by the sounds of children playing in a place where no child had ever set foot. The mystery is not just where those voices were coming from in the middle of a frozen wasteland, but why a man of pure science would eventually follow those sounds into a machine that was never meant to hold anything living. The mystery is how the silence of the most isolated place on Earth can suddenly become crowded with the ghosts of a past that shouldn't exist there. It is a story about what happens when the mind is pushed to the very edge of reality by the cold and the dark. The wind in Antarctica during the winter months does not just howl, it screams with a high-pitched frequency that vibrates through the thick metal walls of the station. It is a bone-chilling, incredibly dry cold that tastes like 1,000 tiny needles in your lungs every time you take a breath. The air inside the lab is so thin and sterile that you can actually smell the ozone from the electrical equipment across the room. It is a sharp, metallic scent that never leaves your nostrils. In the total darkness of the 6-month night, the silence outside is so heavy it feels like it is trying to physically crush the building. The only constant is the low, rhythmic thrum of the station's power plant, a sound that becomes the heartbeat of your world. When the wind stops for a few seconds, the quiet is so absolute that you can hear the blood rushing through your own veins. It is a place where your senses start to play tricks on you just to fill the terrifying void of the ice. David was 45 years old and was the kind of man who found deep comfort in a well-organized spreadsheet. He wore heavy wool sweaters and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses that were always sliding down his nose. He wasn't someone who believed in ghost stories or the supernatural. To David, the world was a collection of biological data points and chemical reactions. He spent his long shifts studying the microscopic life forms that survived in the freezing waters of the Ross Sea. He was a father of 2 young girls, and he kept their drawings taped to the side of his primary workstation. He was a man of logic who believed that every problem had a rational explanation if you looked close enough. He was grounded, focused, and respected by everyone at the station for his calm demeanor during the long, stressful months of isolation. He was the anchor of the biology team, the person they looked to when the cabin fever started to set in for the younger researchers. Every evening at exactly 9 o'clock, David began a routine that was the definition of scientific discipline. He would walk from the living quarters to the query lab, his boots crunching on the dry, frozen floorboards of the corridor. He would enter the lab, turn on the low-intensity red lights to preserve his night vision, and begin the process of preparing his samples. He would spend exactly 10 minutes cleaning his glass slides with a specialized solution of pure alcohol. He would then move to the large industrial centrifuge in the corner of the room. This machine was his primary tool, a heavy piece of equipment that spun his samples at thousands of revolutions per minute. He would carefully balance the tubes, checking the weight on a digital scale down to the milligram. He believed that even the smallest imbalance would ruin months of hard work. He would then close the heavy lid, lock the safety latch, and set the timer for exactly 4 hours. While the centrifuge was running, he would sit at his desk and begin the long process of entering his data into the station's main computer. He would type with a steady, rhythmic pace, the clicking of the keys being the only sound in the room besides the high-pitched whine of the spinning machine. He would do this for hours, rarely looking up from the screen. He found a sense of peace in the boring, repetitive nature of the work. It made the time pass faster in the dark. He would take a short break every hour to drink a cup of lukewarm instant coffee. He would sit on his stool and stare out the small, triple-paned window at the endless blackness of the Antarctic night. He would watch the way the snow drifted against the glass, forming patterns that looked like frozen waves. He would count the minutes until the centrifuge finished its cycle. 60, 59, 58. It was a mental exercise that kept him from thinking about the thousands of miles of ice. Before the shift ended, he would carefully remove the samples from the machine and place them in the deep freeze storage unit. He would wipe down the centrifuge with a clean cloth, moving in slow, circular motions until the stainless steel surface was gleaming. He would then record the final run times in his physical logbook using a blue ink pen. It was a safe, predictable world of science and measurement that he had mastered over 3 different deployments to the ice. The shift happened on a Tuesday night in late July, right in the middle of the deepest part of the winter. David was about 3 hours into a centrifuge run when he heard a sound that didn't belong in the lab. It wasn't a mechanical squeak or a hum. It was a faint, melodic sound that sounded exactly like a child giggling. David froze, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He looked toward the door, thinking one of the other researchers might be playing a prank on him. But the heavy security door was closed and locked from the inside. He checked the lab's internal monitor, but the hallway was empty. He sat back, telling himself that it was just the wind whistling through the ventilation ducts, or perhaps a strange harmonic vibration from the centrifuge itself. He went back to his typing, but 10 minutes later, he heard it again. This time it wasn't just a giggle, it was the sound of 2 distinct voices whispering and laughing together. The voices sounded small and high-pitched, like children playing a game of tag in a backyard. David felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He stood up and walked around the lab, checking under the tables and behind the storage lockers. He was a man of logic, and he knew for a fact that there were no children within 3,000 miles of McMurdo Station. Yet the sound was so clear, it felt like they were standing right next to him. He reached for his headset, thinking he might be picking up a stray radio signal from the communications hut, but the headset was unplugged. The voices continued, getting louder and more frantic, and then he realized where the sound was coming from. It wasn't the walls or the vents. The laughing and the whispering were coming from inside the centrifuge while it was spinning at 10,000 revolutions per minute. The sound was coming from the heart of the machine. You are standing in that small, dimly lit laboratory in the middle of a frozen continent. You are a scientist, a man who believes in the physical world and the laws of motion. But right now, you are listening to the sounds of happy, playing children emanating from a heavy steel drum that is spinning fast enough to kill anything inside of it. Your heart is slamming against your ribs, and your mouth has gone completely dry. Do you hit the emergency stop button and look inside? Or do you walk out of the lab and never come back, admitting that the isolation has finally broken your mind? Because here is the thing. David was a man who needed to know the truth. He hit the stop button. He watched as the centrifuge slowly braked, the high-pitched whine descending into a low growl until it finally came to a complete halt. The voices didn't fade away as the machine slowed down. In fact, they got clearer, until they were almost a scream of joy. David reached out with a trembling hand and threw back the safety latch. He lifted the heavy lid, expecting to find that he didn't even know what. But as he looked down into the rotor, the voices stopped instantly. There were only his biological samples, sitting perfectly still in their plastic tubes. But there was one thing that shouldn't have been there. Lying at the bottom of the steel chamber was a small, colorful plastic bead. It was a bead from his daughter's jewelry kit. The bizarre reveal came when David returned to the States a month later. He had taken the bead with him, a small physical proof that he wasn't crazy. When he got home, he found his daughter playing in the living room with the same kit. He asked her if she had lost any beads lately, and she looked at him with a strange expression. She told him that she hadn't lost any, but that she had sent one to him because she knew he was lonely in the big, dark building on the ice. She described the lab perfectly, including the red lights and the spinning machine, even though David had never shown her pictures of his workspace. She told him that she and her sister would go there every night in their dreams to play near the machine because it made a funny sound that they liked. The voices David had heard weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were the projected memories of his own children, reaching out across the globe to find their father in the dark. David never went back to Antarctica. He realized that the isolation wasn't just a physical distance, it was a thin spot in the fabric of reality where the things you love and the things you fear can find a way in. He took a teaching job at a university close to home, where the only sounds he hears at night are his daughters sleeping in the next room. He still has the bead, but he keeps it in a locked drawer far away from anything that spins or hums in the middle of the night. But while David was finding his way back to the warmth of his family, thousands of miles away in the heart of Tokyo, a different kind of professor was refusing to leave his post. At the University of Tokyo, the labs are filled with the latest technology and the brightest minds, but one room remains frozen in time. A professor who passed away decades ago is said to still be standing at his microscope, and the students are about to find out that his final lecture isn't over yet. Story 11. The Eternal Professor, University of Tokyo. In the early 1990s, a world-renowned materials scientist named Professor Kenji Tanaka was a legend at the University of Tokyo. He was a man of immense intellect, a dedicated teacher who lived for his research and genuinely loved his students. He was exactly where he wanted to be, on the verge of a massive breakthrough in nanotechnology that would change the world. He was doing exactly what any genius would do to secure his legacy and help humanity progress. But instead of receiving a prestigious award and seeing his work published in the finest journals, Professor Tanaka would be found dead at his workstation late one Friday night. He was found with his eyes still pressed against the eyepieces of his favorite microscope, his hand still gripping a fountain pen. The mystery is why, 30 years later, the digital displays in his old laboratory still show his handwriting, warning of events that have not even happened yet. The air inside Laboratory Number 4 at the University of Tokyo didn't just feel still. It felt heavy with the thick, cloying scent of old cedarwood shelves and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone that hung in the corners like a physical weight. It was a cold, clinical environment where the white-tiled floor was polished to a mirror-like shine that reflected the pale green glow of the server racks. Every breath you took felt like it was filtered through a layer of ancient dust. In the dead of night, the silence in that lab was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic whirring of a cooling fan and the occasional sharp crack of the building settling into the earth. It was a place where the darkness seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that you felt in your teeth rather than heard with your ears. The shadows in the back of the room were so deep they looked like solid objects, and the air always felt 5 degrees colder than the hallway. Haruto was 25 years old and was a brilliant graduate student who prided himself on his unwavering commitment to logic. He wore a crisp, white lab coat and a pair of thin-rimmed glasses that he was constantly adjusting. He wasn't someone who believed in the rumors about the haunted university labs. To Haruto, the world was a series of chemical formulas and physical constants. He believed that everything, no matter how strange, had a perfectly rational cause. He spent his nights in Lab 4 because it was the only place he could truly focus on his complex calculations. He was the kind of person who would spend 6 hours double-checking a single equation. He had a stable life, a supportive family, and a bright future in the tech industry. He was grounded, rational, and completely focused on his work. He found a deep sense of peace in the order of the laboratory, believing that as long as he followed the rules, the world made sense. Every evening at precisely 10 o'clock, Haruto followed a routine that was the definition of academic precision. He would enter the lab, log into his workstation, and begin the long process of cleaning his specialized lenses. He would use a soft, lint-free cloth and a drop of high-purity ethanol. He would wipe the glass in slow, circular motions, starting from the center and moving outward. He believed that even a single microscopic speck of dust could ruin a whole month of data. He would then move to the primary electron microscope, the same one that had belonged to Professor Tanaka decades ago. He would spend the next 3 hours preparing his samples, which required a level of patience that would have broken most people. He would use a pair of silver tweezers to place a thin slice of silicon on a copper grid. He would do this over and over again until the placement was perfect. 1, 2, 3. He never rushed, and he never made a mistake. While he worked, he would listen to the low, constant drone of the air filtration system. It was a hypnotic sound, a boring pulse that became the heartbeat of his night. He would count the number of times the digital clock on the wall changed. 10:59, 11 o'clock, 11 o'clock and 1 minute. It was a mental exercise that kept him sharp. He found comfort in the repetitive nature of the work. It allowed him to enter a state of deep focus where nothing else existed. He would then take a short break to drink a bottle of green tea and eat a small rice ball. He would sit on a tall stool and stare at the digital whiteboard on the far wall. It was a modern piece of equipment, but it sat right next to an old dusty chalkboard that the university refused to remove out of respect for the past. Haruto would watch the screensaver on the digital board, thinking about the millions of atoms he was trying to manipulate. It was a safe, predictable world. Before his shift ended at 4 in the morning, he would carefully back up all of his data to the central server. He would type with a steady, rhythmic pace, the clicking of the keys being the only human sound in the room. He would then wipe down his desk, organize his notes into a leather binder, and lock his drawer. He believed that order was the only way to achieve greatness. He was a man of the physical world who had no room for ghost stories or ancient legends. The shift happened on a humid Friday night in late August, right around the anniversary of Professor Tanaka's passing. Haruto was in the middle of a very long, mundane stretch of data entry when he noticed a small smudge on the lens of his microscope. He reached for his cleaning cloth, but as he looked closer, he realized the smudge wasn't on the outside. It looked like a tiny, perfectly formed kanji character etched into the very glass of the internal lens. He paused, his brow furrowed in confusion. He checked the other lenses, but they were all clear. He looked back at the first one, and the character had changed. It was no longer a smudge. It was a clear, sharp word that translated to warning. Haruto felt a sudden, sharp drop in the air pressure, a sensation that made his ears pop as if he were in a descending airplane. He looked around the lab, but everything appeared normal. The servers hummed, and the lights flickered. He told himself it was just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the late hour. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, but when he put them back on, the word on the lens had been replaced by a series of numbers. 6, 1, 1, 1, 4, 4, 6. They didn't look like any formula he was working on. They looked like a timestamp. Haruto felt a wave of cold air wash over him, a chill so intense it felt like he was standing in front of an open freezer. He stood up to check the thermostat, but as he did, he heard a sound that didn't belong in a modern laboratory. It was the sound of a fountain pen scratching across a piece of paper coming from the old desk in the corner. It was a dry, rhythmic sound that was perfectly synchronized with the ticking of the clock. Haruto turned his head slowly, and in the reflection of the dark window, he saw a man sitting at the desk. The man was wearing an old-fashioned brown suit. You are standing in that silent, high-tech lab. You are a scientist, a man who believes in the physical world and the laws of nature. But right now, you are watching a dead man write a message on a digital board that isn't even plugged in. Your heart is slamming against your ribs, and your skin is crawling with a static charge. Do you run for the exit and never look back? Or do you walk toward that board and read what a man from 30 years ago is trying to tell you? Because here is the thing. Haruto was a man who needed to understand the data. He walked toward the board, he watched as the numbers shifted and blurred until they formed a very specific date and time. It was the date of the following Tuesday, and the time was 2:46 in the afternoon. Below the numbers, the handwriting became more frantic, forming a single large kanji for earthquake. Haruto felt a sudden pressure on his shoulder, like a heavy, firm hand. He spun around, but the room was empty. The reflection in the window was gone, and the digital board was once again displaying its standard screensaver. Haruto stood there in the silence, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He looked down at his own notebook, and there, on the very last page, was a smudge of fresh ink from a fountain pen. It was a small, circular mark, exactly where a man would have rested his hand while thinking. It was a final, physical proof. The bizarre reveal came the following Tuesday at exactly 2:46 in the afternoon. A massive earthquake struck the region, one of the largest in recorded history. Because Haruto had taken the warning seriously, he had convinced the university to evacuate Lab 4 and the surrounding buildings for a safety drill. When the tremors hit, the ceiling of Lab 4 collapsed entirely, crushing the very desk where Haruto usually sat. Not a single person was injured. Haruto eventually finished his research, but he never worked in Lab 4 again. He kept the notebook with the ink smudge as a reminder that there are some things that cannot be measured by a microscope or calculated by a computer. He says that Professor Tanaka didn't stay behind to haunt the students. He stayed behind to finish his most important experiment, which was the protection of his university. The Eternal Professor was still teaching, even from the other side. But while Haruto was finding a new appreciation for the mysteries of the universe in Tokyo, halfway across the world in the massive underground tunnels of Switzerland, a group of physicists were about to encounter a different kind of ghost. At the CERN facility, the most powerful machine ever built was about to tear a hole in the fabric of reality. And in that split second of collision, they were about to find out that when you look into the abyss, sometimes the abyss looks back. Story 12, The Collider Ghosts. In the autumn of 2012, a high-level particle physicist named Dr. Elena Fischer was working at the European Organization for Nuclear Research, better known as CERN, in Switzerland. She was a woman of absolute logic, a world leader in her field who spent her days exploring the very fabric of reality at the largest and most complex machine ever built by human hands. She had a prestigious career, a loving partner, and a mind that was trained to reject anything that could not be proven by an equation. She was exactly where she wanted to be, standing at the threshold of the greatest discovery in human history. But instead of celebrating the confirmation of the Higgs boson, Elena would find herself staring into a surveillance monitor that was showing her something that defied every law of time and space. She would see a figure in the tunnels that didn't just look like a ghost, but looked like a version of herself from a decade ago, performing actions that she remembered doing, but in a place she hadn't visited in years. The mystery is not just how a particle collider could create a rift in time, but why the version of Elena in the monitor seemed to be trying to warn her about the very experiment she was currently running. The air inside the tunnels of the Large Hadron Collider, deep beneath the border of France and Switzerland, didn't just feel cool. It felt unnaturally still, as if the atmosphere itself was being held in a state of suspended animation by the massive superconducting magnets. It had a sharp, sterile smell of liquid helium and ionized air that made the back of your throat feel tight and dry. The tunnels were bathed in a flat, artificial white light that cast no real shadows, making the 27-kilometer ring feel like it stretched on for an eternity into a void. In the dead of night, the silence was so profound that you could hear the microscopic vibrations of the magnets as they cooled to 1.9 degrees Kelvin, a temperature colder than outer space. It was a low, subsonic thrum that you felt in the marrow of your bones, a sound that made your skin crawl with a static charge you couldn't wipe away. It was a place where the rules of the macro world didn't seem to apply, and the darkness in the service alcoves felt like it was waiting for the light to fail so it could reclaim the space. Elena was 42 years old and was the kind of person who found beauty in the complexity of a Feynman diagram. She wore a simple navy blue blazer and kept her hair in a practical, no-nonsense bob. She wasn't someone who had any patience for ghost stories or urban legends about portals to other dimensions. To Elena, the universe was a giant, elegant machine that could be understood through mathematics. She spent her free time playing chess and volunteering at a local animal shelter, living a life that was as grounded and rational as the theories she studied. She was the daughter of 2 university professors, and she had been raised to question everything until it could be verified. She was a woman of habit who found comfort in the predictable nature of the physical world. She was respected by her peers for her ironclad focus and her ability to remain calm, even when the most expensive equipment in the world was malfunctioning. She was the anchor of the Atlas experiment, the person who made sure the data was pure and the logic was sound. She was completely focused on the monumental task of uncovering the origin of mass. Every morning at precisely 6:45, Elena began a routine that was the definition of scientific rigor. She would arrive at the main control center, swipe her security badge, and head straight to the coffee machine. She would wait for exactly 30 seconds for the espresso to brew, then walk to her workstation. She would spend the next hour reviewing the beam parameters from the previous night, checking the stability of the proton streams as they circled the ring at nearly the speed of light. She believed that even the smallest fluctuation was a clue to be solved. She would then begin the long, tedious process of monitoring the cryogenic systems. This involved checking thousands of sensors across the entire 27-kilometer loop. She would look at the pressure levels, the flow rates, and the temperature of the liquid helium. She would record the numbers in a digital ledger with a level of detail that was almost obsessive. 1, 2, 3. She never skipped a step, and she never assumed a system was working unless she saw the data for herself. It was a rhythmic, calming ritual that made her feel in control. During the actual collision runs, she would sit in the dimly lit control room for 12 hours at a time. She would watch the screens as billions of particles smashed into each other, creating tiny, short-lived bursts of energy that mimicked the conditions of the Big Bang. She would count the number of high-energy events, looking for the specific signature of a particle that shouldn't exist. It was a slow, deliberate stretch of time where the only sounds were the clicking of keyboards and the low hum of the massive server racks. She found a deep sense of peace in the boring repetition. She would take a short break to walk through the service corridors, stretching her legs and clearing her head. She would count her steps as she moved through the concrete tunnels. 50, 100, 200. It was a mental exercise that kept her grounded in the physical world. She would watch the way the cables were bundled along the ceiling, thinking about the petabytes of data flowing through them every second. She found comfort in the order of the facility. She believed that as long as the magnets stayed cold and the beam stayed centered, the world was exactly as it should be. Before her shift ended at 8 o'clock in the evening, she would perform a final sweep of the monitoring cameras. She would toggle through the views of the different sectors, making sure no technicians were left in the tunnels before the next high-energy run. She would look at the grainy black and white images of empty hallways and silent machinery. It was a safe, predictable world of steel and glass. She was a woman of logic who knew that the only things moving in those tunnels were subatomic particles. She was completely unprepared for the anomaly that was about to occur. The shift happened on a humid Tuesday in July, right in the middle of a record-breaking energy run. Elena was finishing her final camera sweep when she noticed a flicker of movement in Sector 4. Usually, the tunnels were completely empty during a run because the radiation levels were lethal, but there, on Monitor 7, was a figure walking slowly down the center of the track. Elena froze, her heart starting to race as she reached for the emergency abort button. She thought a maintenance worker had been trapped inside, and she had seconds to save their life. But as she reached for the button, she looked closer at the screen and realized something impossible. The figure wasn't wearing the modern orange safety vest of a CERN technician. They were wearing a dark green wool sweater and carrying a specific type of blue coffee mug. Elena's hand stopped inches from the button. She recognized that sweater. She had lost it in a move 10 years ago. And she recognized that mug. She had broken it in 2002. She watched the screen in total silence as the figure turned its head, and she saw her own face from a decade ago. She felt a sudden, sharp drop in the air pressure in the control room, a sensation like the world was being sucked out of a tiny hole. The lights flickered with a static charge that made her hair stand up, and the low thrum of the magnets suddenly jumped into a high-pitched scream that only she seemed to hear. Elena looked at her colleagues, but they were all staring at their own screens, oblivious to the fact that the fabric of reality was tearing open right in front of them. The silence in the room was now so thick it felt like she was underwater, drowning in the logic of a world that no longer made sense. You are sitting in that high-tech control room, surrounded by the smartest people on the planet, and you are watching a live video feed of yourself from 10 years ago walking through a tunnel that is currently filled with lethal radiation. You are a physicist. You know that time is a one-way street. But the version of you on that screen is stopping, looking directly into the camera, and she is crying. She is mouthing a word over and over again, and you realize she is saying the word stop. Do you hit the button and ruin a billion-dollar experiment? Or do you trust the math? Because here is the thing. Elena didn't have to choose. The version of her in the monitor reached out and touched the camera lens, and in that instant, the entire Atlas detector went dark. The beam was lost, the magnets quenched, and the experiment was over. When the power was restored and the security teams entered Sector 4, they found the tunnel completely empty. There was no technician, no ghost, and no green sweater. But lying on the concrete floor, directly under the camera, was a single, cold, ceramic handle from a blue coffee mug that had been broken for 10 years. The bizarre reveal came weeks later when Elena was reviewing the archived data from the moment of the crash. She found that at the exact second she saw herself on the monitor, the collider had accidentally produced a microscopic black hole that had existed for less than a billionth of a second. According to the data, that tiny rift had connected 2 points in the CERN timeline. The Elena from 10 years ago hadn't been a ghost. She had been a real person who, in her own time, had seen a terrifying vision of a future explosion that she managed to prevent by reaching into a glitch. The experiment was hailed as a success, even with the crash, because it proved that the collider could manipulate the fundamental structure of time. But Elena never felt like a hero. She realized that the version of her from the past had sacrificed her own peace of mind to save a future she would never see. Elena resigned from CERN a year later. She moved to a small village in the Alps, far away from any machines that hummed or monitors that flickered. She says that once you've seen yourself as a ghost, you never look at the present moment the same way again. The Large Hadron Collider continues to run, searching for the secrets of the dark universe, but the staff still whispers about the things that appear in the monitors during the highest energy runs. They say that if you look close enough at the empty tunnels, you might catch a glimpse of someone you used to be, still walking the ring, still trying to find a way back to a world where time makes sense. But for Elena, the search for answers was over. She found that the most important truth wasn't hidden in a particle, but in the quiet silence of a life lived away from the edge of the abyss. This concludes our journey through the 12 haunted laboratories of the world, from the horrific units of the past to the high-tech colliders of the future. Each story is a reminder that no matter how much we think we understand the universe, there are always shadows that science cannot illuminate and voices that logic cannot silence. Whether it is a face in the wood or a rift in time, the strange, the dark, and the mysterious are always just one experiment away from finding us in the dark. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep your eyes on the data, but never ignore the shadows. And that is going to do it for today's story. Once again, thank you so much for your time and for sticking around until the very end. Your presence, your comments, and your shares are what truly drive me to keep digging deep into these unsolved mysteries. If you found this story compelling or maybe just a little too haunting, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, keep an eye out for anything out of the ordinary, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.